Good morning, everybody. I do want to start by saying a little bit about what this study is and what it isn't. The official formal title of this started out as being the Downtown Network Alternatives Analysis, which was really a mouthful, so we just shortened it to Mobility Study. But this is not a transportation master plan of all the potential transportation projects that we could consider for downtown. We really have honed in on possible modifications to existing roadways to make them safer, to make them more accessible, and to invite more connection with neighborhoods. So just to clarify, it's not a master plan for all of your downtown transportation needs, but we work with FDOT to, in their words, to do this the right way, kind of a step-by-step process of evaluating the feasibility of looking at modifications to the downtown transportation network, and then that I'll get to later what might be some next steps. This slide shows the study area where we focused in on the area between about 5th Avenue North and about 5th Avenue South, but that black line around there, that border, is really where we look at impacts to potential modifications of the downtown network. Next slide. So we certainly wanted to take a conservative approach to how we look at the future. And when I say conservative approach, it means we kind of throw in all the anticipated growth and development that we expect to happen by 2045, so that we have kind of an aggressive perspective of how many people might be living and working and moving and in and out of downtown in the future. And that's about 15,000 more people living in that core part of downtown, that study area, and about another 14,000 jobs in that area by the year 2045. And what's interesting is we're only projecting about 93,000 additional residents in Pinellas County. So that's a pretty large percentage of the total population growth. So that just speaks to how dynamic and vibrant downtown St. Petersburg has become in the last few years and will continue to be. The other thing is, as we look at the safety issues, we find that about 43% of our crashes in that downtown core area are on the one-way pair streets, and that really only comprises about 17% of the network. So there's something there that it's either speed related or confusion related, but that is causing some of the conflicts on the road network. And I think that's worth noting. Next slide. So some of the things that we've learned as we've gone through this study is that in doing case study research, best practices, digging into some of the data from around the country, one-way streets are less safe than two-way streets because of that confusion factor, speed factor, the maybe inability or frustration for people to get exactly where they want to go without making U-turns and turning around. And they also improve business visibility and business accessibility. There is a role for one-way streets, and so for that reason, we've chosen to not make any recommendations or touch the First Avenues because there's already substantial things being done there. So we're really looking at the 8th and 9th and 3rd and 4th one-way pairs. For the interstate spurs, there are a number of communities around the country that have begun to modify their interstate network to address livability, economic development, and connectivity goals. And there's some really great successes, whether you're in Seattle or you're in Rochester or Columbus, Ohio, and they all take different forms. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. If you've been to San Francisco, you've seen some pretty dramatic changes to some modifications there, Boston as well. So we are really focused on how do you get the most out of your network for all users, and that's really been some of the things we found. We have met with the first responders, with emergency professionals, and have gotten their feedback, and it's been a little varied depending on the perspective. Sunstar said we absolutely have no concern about losing 175 or 375. That's not really something that's important to us. However, the fire department has said something very different because level 1 trauma center, they need to get there pretty fast, and so speed and efficiency of the network is important to them. So we've heard a couple of different perspectives on that. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk you through the key projects as we go through downtown. It's about 4 or 5 projects. Let's go ahead and advance. And we'll start with the ML King Street, 8th Street. And what we looked at here is conversion from one-way to two-way. And those little red areas that we've identified are where we have concentrations of traffic crashes. And we feel like a two-way conversion would ameliorate or address some of those safety concerns at those locations. There's stable traffic flow in our modeling of the future scenarios with the streets being two-way streets. We do see, under a worst-case scenario, about 35 seconds of intersection delay that is created in the year 2045. And every downtown has some level of traffic congestion, so that doesn't strike us as being unusual or unsustainable. In fact, it actually feels pretty good that there's a modest level of congestion. But overall, we're not seeing a lot of congestion on the downtown streets because there's excess capacity on these roadways, and we think it can be accommodated fairly well. There is some intersection delay that's built in. And then there's a travel time increase because you are now slowing down traffic to travel more consistently at 30 to 35 miles an hour as opposed to 40 to 45 miles an hour. This does enable more walkable streets, more bike paths, and potentially more economic development because you're creating these roads more like a beach drive and a central avenue than a pipeline to get in and out of downtown quickly. The city would like to look at modifying the diagonal streets on this one-way pair so that you reconnect the grid street, and so that's something that they've heard from the neighborhoods as well, that there's some support for that. So for 175, this started, as Evan mentioned, with the Tropicana Field redevelopment master plan, where the city's consultant said if you're looking to create a neighborhood and not just a stadium where you need high volumes in and out of that stadium, but you're looking for a destination in a neighborhood, then it makes sense to consider eliminating 175 because it opens it up to everyone. And I'll compare this to a similar redevelopment effort in Orlando that I was part of, the Naval Training Center, which is 3 miles away from downtown Orlando. And ultimately, the master plan there reconnected all the street grids in downtown Orlando, despite fervent opposition from my city, the city of Winter Park. And ultimately, the projections of horrific traffic and traffic delays didn't materialize because they built a grid street network, and it all worked out really well. So the lessons learned from Orlando, I think, are relevant to the Tropicana Field site. Embrace the grid, embrace that connectivity, and when both of these interstate spurs are operating at 40% of their capacity, even in the peak period, you have an opportunity to reconnect that grid. And I think Orlando is a really good lesson learned because that's really a vibrant neighborhood now that doesn't look a whole lot different than the rest of the surrounding neighborhoods. So you get a lot of benefit from that. And there has been significant public and business support for the 175 removal, and we've heard that feedback as we've gone through this study. Next slide, please. So from a traffic modeling and analysis standpoint, this is a lot more doable from our perspective than 375 because you have more right-of-way in the 4th and 5th Avenue South corridor than you do in the 5th Avenue North, 4th Avenue North area. And there's one significant traffic crash hotspot that we think we could better manage. It would create less confusion, but what we really open up here is the opportunity of more than 4 miles of walkable bicycle-friendly streets, about 25 acres of new development, and 8 new street connections that we've modeled. And when we modeled the traffic, we would keep that full interchange at 275, so you'd still have that southern regional access. But the streets are not congested. You're able to manage the future demand for travel on the existing street network. There is some increase in travel time because you're not driving 60 to 70 miles an hour on an interstate spur. And believe me, I've done it quite a lot. There is a little bit additional travel time to the hospitals for you and me. It's not necessarily for emergency vehicles that are flashing their signals. But that's the trade-off, and that's what we need to evaluate as we move forward. Next slide. So again, it would be the same high bar of getting that federal and state approval because of the nature of these limited access facilities. But it would enable access to businesses and economic growth, economic development opportunity, safer streets, and it would help reimagine the Tropicana Field site in a way that maybe is more compatible with adjacent neighborhoods. Excellent. So I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Whit. I'm going to go through a few slides from the Tropicana Field Master Plan study and then walk through some historical information that we were able to find as well. So this is a slide directly from that just is a depiction of how the interstate system downtown 175, 375, and 275 act as barriers. The trop site's highlighted, but we're just surrounded by that, and ultimately, there's no chance of major modifications to I-275, but there's things that can be done there to help more seamless transition under it, more friendly. We can do things for I-375 as well. We are right now with like the park at ML King Street under 375. Here, more specifically, I-175, how it interacts with the stadium and Campbell Park and the neighborhoods to the south. It's just built up so high that it's definitely a barrier. And there's only 4 lanes of traffic on the highway spur, but with the shoulders and everything else, you actually have a 450-foot wide right-of-way that it is a federal right-of-way here. Another depiction of how the interstate is raised high, noise wall, and blocks off from south to north from the park and the neighborhoods to the stadium. And ultimately, the master plan called for better connections to the neighborhoods and districts, knitting the city back together, which falls in many ways on the transportation network. Into some of the history, we looked at a 1960s aerial and overlaid and shaded back the interstate built on top of the homes and the businesses and through here. And you can really see how wide that right-of-way is by the box, and you can see the existing footprint of the interstate. This is just from 16th Street down to the ML King Street. And one other thing that's noticeable is how small Campbell Park was at the time, and how there were homes between Campbell Park and the future I-175. So looking back at some old articles from when the paper was called the St. Petersburg Times back in the good days before they changed their name, it talked about the impacts that would occur. And this article talked about why did the city of St. Pete ask the state and the feds to create these interstate spurs? And it was because of what was perceived as sprawl. The tractors, the businesses downtown were too spread out, and they thought that they were losing out on business to suburban shopping malls with easier vehicular access. And so the purpose of the spurs was to create faster and easier vehicular access to a certain place, which was 4th Street. And they wanted the destinations to cluster around 4th Street. They thought the consolidation would basically make downtown viable again, because it was really struggling in the 1960s and 1970s. Then a year later, this study was published. This was a study that was published regarding engineering, environmental, and social impacts of the interstate. This looked at a phase that started at 18th Avenue North and continued south to the Skyway Bridge connection. There was a period of time when the interstate construction actually stalled out at 5th Avenue North. So it was a dead-end interstate at 5th Avenue North, and people had to get off and use 5th Avenue or other streets around there to either get over to 4th Street or get over to 34th Street, and then use 34th Street to continue down to the Skyway Bridge. But this study had a lot of good historical information in it. It was published in 1974. So this shows the South Distributor, or 175, South Bay Drive. It comes as a lot of different names, but it also explained how Campbell Park got bigger. Campbell Park became an ancillary project associated with the interstate. There are actually 15 projects that the city of St. Petersburg asked to tack on to the federal project, and the same process was used for relocation of businesses and homes to create room for, like, the Water Resources Complex, and for Campbell Park, the expansion of what was called the 16th Street Middle School at the time, I think, now John Hopkins. So the study addressed some of the known impacts that the project would have on the community. It documented that everyone displaced by 175 was minority and low income, while many were also single-parent households. And the study did warn that the relocation of this particular group in this particular neighborhood result in heightened financial and social problems. There were 163 parcels taken, 278 families, individuals, businesses, or nonprofits were relocated just for the 175 and Campbell Park expansion. In addition to those directly impacted by needing to get out of the way of the project, the study documented that the new interstate feeder would deter social interaction among those who continued to live on either side of the highway. So in other words, you didn't have to be relocated to be negatively impacted, you just had to live in the general area. And the project moved forward, and the Times published some pictures of the houses and businesses coming down. And then fast forward to now, 45 years later, and part of our outreach was with the Campbell Park neighborhood, and through the comments that you can see on this slide, there's really a lot of support from those that live closest to the interstate spur for modification or removal. So, certain decisions were made a long time ago, and those can't be undone. But now we wanted to look at not what was the impact then necessarily. That's important, but what's the impact now? Is it still a negative impact? And so the opinion of many folks is that it is still a negative impact. And back to Whit to talk about a little bit more of the public outreach.
So we've had 2 rounds of significant public outreach early on in the study, where before we had alternatives or scenarios identified, we asked people what they'd like to see happen in the downtown transportation network, what concerns they have, what opportunities. And then that led directly to the development of our scenarios, how we evaluated the scenarios, what kind of performance measures or considerations we gave to all the alternatives. And then once we tested that and we had some results, we then went back out pretty much through the month of October and a lot of November. And we're actually still continuing to hold meetings. We've got some one-on-ones with the hospitals that are pending. And so we've had a lot of community conversations. A lot of people participated virtually. We had recently one in-person meeting. I thought the attendance was reasonably good, but the virtual participation has been very good. And in some cases, we're just dropping in on existing community meetings, whether it's 16th Street Business Association or it's Campbell Park neighborhood meeting, and they're giving us 5, 10, 15 minutes of time just to get their feedback on some things. So I think we've done a pretty good job at getting that input, and we certainly welcome more feedback as this moves forward. And we're not done. So even with the conclusion of this study, whatever next phase is going to have significant public participation. Next slide, please. So we're finding that for 175 and 375, there's a fair amount of support for removal or modification of those interstate spurs. A lot of people still need more information, and that's fair. And then I would say 175 has got more support than 375. That's also fair. But this just kind of gives you a sense of the timeline of that public participation. Now we have this December, January, February timeline is where we're really forming our recommendations, and we're putting together a draft action plan for consideration by the city, by the department, by my agency, Ford Pinellas, and by the community, and that is in draft form, and we expect to have that published January timeframe, probably. Okay, next slide, please. And so I just wanted to use this slide to highlight a journey that we're on, depending on the type of project. The one-way pair conversions, particularly 8th and 9th, those are city streets. That's a fairly easy decision-making process compared to the other ones. 3rd and 4th are state-maintained facilities, so that requires state approval. Those will still have an engineering design component, but there's a relatively straightforward and lower cost associated with those. The signals, the modification of the signals would be probably the biggest cost factor, but otherwise it's paint and restriping and repaving the roadways. For the spur removal, we would have to go through what's called a reverse interchange justification report and a project development environment study. Those tend to be $2.5 million, take 2-3 years, and then you've got the approval process, and then you go into design, and then hopefully you get construction money. You're really looking at a 10-12 year period for the interstate spur removal. So let's be real clear that nothing's happening next year. For the one-way to two-way conversion, that could be a much faster track process. In all of these, for the interstate spurs, there would be a robust development of alternatives that would include things like looking at a boulevard, looking at a viaduct or capping of the interstate spur while you keep the capacity in place. Cultural resource assessments, park, open space, or development, those kinds of discussions we really haven't had in the study. We have not shown renderings, we have not shown ideas, and that would really need a next step. Let's go ahead and next slide, please.
Well, thank you very much, Whit. And, for those of you who don't know, divining information and intents and purposes from FDOT is a skill and an art. And thank you for being our FDOT whisperer. Well, clearly what I hear, what I'm taking away, and this comports with what I've heard over the last few years, is that it's really a no-go on removing the 375 spur. But it sounds like there's an openness to removing the 175 spur that's much stronger than what I've heard over the years, and that's really a good thing. And again, I know some people get frustrated when they hear, oh, studies, more studies, I'm tired of studying things. Well, this study was absolutely necessary and required as a first step to whatever subsequent feasibility study, PD&E, any steps to look at feasibility and get funding. This study was necessary, and in addition to that, this study encompassed much more than just the highway spur removal. So I think we got a good deal, and thank you to Forward Pinellas for chipping in with funding for the study. This study was paid for by FDOT, the city, and Forward Pinellas. So thank you for that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions about 175 removal, but I did want to circle back real quick to the project of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Street and 8th Street and the removal of that diagonal grid on the south side of that connection in Roser Park. And I think this sounds like a totally good idea. I travel that corridor several times a week. And I know this is outside the scope of the study, but I did want to throw this out there since these are city roads, correct, Evan?
Right.
When and if we got rid of that diagonal connection, that opens up a lot of dirt, if you will, for potential housing in an area that already has a great deal of somewhat aged, but multi-unit, 3-level garden apartments. And so removal of that would not only help restore the grid, get rid of unnecessary pavement, but I think it gives us an excellent opportunity to look at more housing opportunities that the city has been talking about seriously and looking high and low to deliver on. And sometimes finding the dirt is part of the issue. And so I just wanted to put that out there. This is my last PSI meeting, but for our future city council members and those who are going on, that will be, I think, something worth keeping an eye on. Evan, did you have any comments about that? I'm sure that's something that must have crossed your mind also.
It is, and we don't know what we would do with the land, but that certainly could be part of it. And we've been hearing this request from people who live in Roser Park for many years. I think out of everything that you've seen that conversion of 8th and ML King Street has had community support and even city council support for over 20 years. There's council voted like 20 years ago that they wanted a two-way 8th and ML King, but there's been things that have been holding us back from doing that, including the bridge that's actually under construction right now, ML King over Booker Creek. So that's being fixed, and we still have to. There's ramps from 8th and 9th to the interstate, so it'll be an interesting one to figure out as well. But that whole northbound curve from 9th connection from 9th to 8th really wouldn't be needed anymore, because if you're going north on 9th, ML King Street, you could just keep going north instead of having to divert, and you could use one of the east-west roads to get over to 8th Street if you really had a destination on 8th. So
Yeah.
makes sense, I think, to eliminate those diagonals on both ends, the north and the south.
Absolutely. And then just really glad to see overall what looks like a welcoming of restoring or converting one-way streets to two-way. It's just really a no-brainer that successful retail, in order to be successful, needs a two-way street, needs to be on the ground floor. And I think that would help on some of our other one-way streets too. I think you would see that would help connect a lot of our, connect and expand our retail. And, of course, affordability for small businesses and storefronts is a big issue too. And that would be, I think the two-way streets would go a long way towards, helping out with that goal. So thank you again. Let me open the floor to other questions from council members. Councilmember Driscoll.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. As most of the area of study is in my district and crosses multiple neighborhoods, this is of particular interest to me. Could you bring up slide number 18 for me, please? And in the meantime, I have a question about, you said we're looking at 8th and 9th Streets and 3rd and 4th Streets. Is there also at some point going to be some consideration given to 4th and 5th Avenues North and South, and both of those going in line with 375 and 175? Are we waiting for like the final decision on that before you start looking at what we should do with those because they're related?
Well, I think it's important for us to tackle the big issue of 375 first. And if we're going to move away from a recommendation of eliminating that, then that allows you to pivot and look at some other things. The state does have a safety project for 5th Avenue North that's moving along, and they will be advancing some safety improvements in the short term. They have considered a lane repurposing of 5th Avenue North as well. They have some concerns about what that might mean in terms of interstate access. So they're kind of taking a little bit of a pause on that portion of the project, but they assure me that that's still a consideration for that. I don't know if you want to speak to.
Well, we did look at the 4th and 5th Avenues North and South in this study, and the traffic was modeled for that. We saw some fairly major issues with 5th Avenue North around 16th Street, which didn't necessarily mean that a design solution couldn't be found. But I think we just prioritized 3rd, 4th, 8th, and 9th a little bit higher. But we're not forgetting about 4th and 5th. I think 4th and 5th are both still feasible, and the analysis showed that for the most part the traffic could be handled on those roads. But I think that 4th and 5th Avenue South are so contingent about, regarding what you do for I-175 that you can't necessarily make a decision, and you can't go ahead and do those now and then potentially have to undo it when you address the interstate. So
Okay.
they're kind of backburnered. I hate to say it, but
no,
they're not off the table.
That's fine. Just wondering where they were
Yeah.
on the list, and thank you for that. I understand and agree that 375, there's a way we can live with that in light of this information about its connection with 275, and that's fine. I think the 16th Street, Complete Streets work that is to come, and then the improvements to Fifth Avenue North, that safety project, will help a lot. But 175 is really more of a priority out in the community when you're talking to people. There's much more advantage to that. However, I would like to just put in the suggestion box that 375, I'm good with keeping it, but I want it to be kept beautiful, and it is not beautiful right now. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be embellished in some way. It looks horrible. And so I do want, that should be part of the deal, or at least part of our overall requests. And the same goes for 175. I wanted to bring this slide up for two reasons. One, you can see just how much work could be done on that wall, even in the short term. And 375 looks pretty much the same all along the way. So I really think that the very least that can be done for us is to clean these up. Let's clean them up now. I don't know what it costs. I don't know who it takes. But please help me with that part, okay? That's what those kids are looking at. We're talking about, we mentioned earlier, you guys were talking about freedom of movement around our city. Eliminating 175, look at that slide. Eliminating 175 creates freedom of movement for these children, for these families. So removal of 175, not only have you shown that logistically it makes sense, it's doable, it's not going to hinder our emergency services, but it will create freedom of movement for folks who have been cut off for far too long. That is extremely important to me. You stand there, I've stood in that park and I look over at that wall and I hate it. So please remember this photo as we continue our discussions on this topic, because people are counting on us to remember that. Thank you.
I do want to say before we wrap up, I think today was a significant conversation. Later tonight, this council will be discussing the adoption of a resolution related to the structural racism study. And if ever there was a structure of racism in this community, it's these highway spurs, and specifically 175. And even as you're heading north on 275, in the bend in the highway before one would get off on the I-75 spur, there's a high wall that was constructed with Hope 6 funds. And that wall was constructed to literally make poverty invisible so that people driving by would not have to see Jordan Park. And I'm proud that we are addressing these issues. And I think that with highway issues and transportation issues, it's always a very long, iterative, somewhat bureaucratic process. But this was an important discussion today to really start to look at ways that we can make it right, where I-75 can be replaced with something that connects our community instead of a wall that keeps us apart. So let's not forget that, because this is really important. And I'm glad that our partners at FDOT, and I'm glad that Pete Buttigieg at the national level, I'm really glad to see a renewed effort to look at the decades of unsustainability and what these highway spurs have wrought on communities, where they basically just really ripped through poor and black and brown communities. So with that, thank you. Councilmember Gabbard, when do you want Lair to start?
We can do 11.
Okay, so it's in 11 minutes, the Lair Committee will start at 11 a.m. Thank you all. This meeting's adjourned.